On the afternoon of May 8, 1959, 4 Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputies carried a 36-year-old widow named Aurora Vargas out of her own front door and down her own front steps. 1 deputy on each arm and 1 on each leg, while she fought them the entire way. A television camera filmed all of it. Within minutes, a bulldozer pushed through the walls of the house her family had built with their own hands. And by that evening, the footage was leading the news across the city. I have watched that newsreel more than once, and the detail that stays with me is not the deputies. It is how close the bulldozer was already parked. The hill where that house stood is now one of the most famous pieces of ground in American sports. On a good summer night, 56,000 people sit on it, eating hot dogs, watching the Los Angeles Dodgers, in a stadium so familiar it feels like it grew out of the rock. Underneath the stadium and its parking lots lie the remains of 3 neighborhoods: Palo Verde, Loma, Bishop. More than 1,000 families lived there, by some counts as many as 1,800 over the years of the removals, almost all of them Mexican-American, many in houses they had built themselves and owned outright. And here's the part almost nobody in those 56,000 seats knows. Aurora Vargas did not lose her home to a baseball team. She lost it to a promise. 9 years before the deputies came, a letter from the city arrived at every house on those hills, telling the families their land was needed for public housing, and promising them first choice of the brand new apartments that would rise where their homes stood. The families were moved out, the homes came down, and the housing was never built. Not one unit, not one wall, not one door. The reason it was never built is stranger than a land grab, and it runs through a secret police file, a loyalty hearing, and a man who would end up in a federal prison cell for believing in the project more than anyone else alive. The collapse of that promise only matters if you know what was on the hill to begin with. And what was on the hill, whatever the city's paperwork later called it, was the closest thing to a village that Los Angeles ever had. Everything I am about to describe is what the city decided had to go. The land took its name from Julian Chavez, a rancher from New Mexico who started buying property in the ravine in 1844, when Los Angeles was still a pueblo of a few thousand people. He served on the first county board of supervisors. He died in 1879. And the hollows and ridges a mile north of downtown kept his name long after the city forgot who he was. The families came 2 generations later, in the early 1900s, and most of them did not come to the ravine first. They tried other neighborhoods and found the doors closed. Restrictive covenants and redlining told Mexican-American buyers, lot by lot and street by street, where they would not be allowed to live. The ravine said yes when the rest of the city said no. So they bought the cheap, steep land above the river, and they carried lumber up the dirt roads, and they built. A land surveyor named Francisco Hernandez Blancarte bought 2 lots in Palo Verde in 1914 and put his family's house on Gabriel Avenue. The Blancartes ran a little store that sold candy, sweetbread, and homemade chorizo, and in the evenings, Francisco stood outside it and played the violin. In 1925, the city built Palo Verde Elementary School at the corner of Effie and Paducah Streets. There was a church, there were gardens on every slope, and children rode homemade wagons down the dirt roads and bought shaved ice drowned in syrup on hot days. During Prohibition, bootleggers hid barrels of wine in the brush above the houses, and when the police found the barrels, they smashed them where they stood, and the neighborhood watched the wine run purple down the hillside. People left their doors unlocked. It was not a wealthy place, and it was not a slum. It was a working neighborhood that fed itself, where a family could walk 2 miles down to the Grand Central Market for whatever the gardens did not grow, and walk back up out of the city's sight. By the 1940s, roughly 1,100 households lived on those hills. The city below barely knew they were up there. In 1949, a young photographer named Don Normark climbed the hill looking for a good view of downtown and found the neighborhood instead. He spent months photographing it, the gardens, the goats, the confirmation dresses, and he said later that he thought he had found a poor man's Shangri-La. He took about 100 pictures. Nobody would understand for 50 years that he had photographed a place in its last full year of ordinary life. Because in July of 1950, an envelope from the city arrived at every one of those houses. The people who opened it had no way of knowing they were reading their neighborhood's death certificate. It was written as a gift. The letter came from the city's housing authority, dated July 24, 1950. A year earlier, Congress had passed the Housing Act of 1949, and Los Angeles had signed up for roughly $110 million federal dollars to build more than 10,000 units of public housing across the city. The biggest single piece of that program was aimed at Chavez Ravine. The letter told the families that their homes would be purchased and cleared, that a public housing development would be built on the site, and that they, the residents, would have first choice of the new apartments. First choice. Here is what that phrase meant in practice. The city was not telling these families to leave. It was telling them to wait. Move out, let the bulldozers work, and come back up the hill to a new home with hot water, a modern kitchen, and rent you can afford. The plan even had a name, Elysian Park Heights, and it was not a modest one. The housing authority hired Richard Neutra, one of the most celebrated modernist architects in America, along with his partner Robert Alexander. Their drawings show 24 towers of 13 stories each, and more than 160 low two-story buildings, close to 3,600 apartments in all, with new schools, new playgrounds, and space for churches. For context, that would have made it one of the largest public housing developments west of Chicago, on a hill with a view of downtown Los Angeles. The man in charge of choosing the site was the Housing Authority's assistant director, Frank Wilkinson. He was in his mid-30s, the son of a wealthy conservative doctor, and he had come back from a trip through the slums of Europe and North Africa converted, with the zeal only a convert has, to the idea that decent housing could be built for poor people by their own government. Wilkinson walked the ravine himself. He sat in the family's kitchens and made the case in person. Trust the program, sign the papers, and you will be first in line for what comes next. Many families believed him. The neighborhood was not destroyed over the residents' objections alone. It was dismantled, at the start, with their reluctant cooperation, because the man asking believed every word he was saying. The buying began in 1951, and the fine print turned out to be harder than the promise. Appraisals came in low, and the scheme was tiered, which meant the longer a family held out, the less they were offered. Some went to court and did better. Most took the check. Francisco Blancarte, the surveyor who had played his violin outside the family store for 36 years, died that December, 5 months after the letters went out, with the neighborhood's fate still unsettled. In 1952, his family took $6,450 for the 2 lots he had bought in 1914 and carried what they could down the hill. By 1953, the neighborhoods were mostly empty. The city sold some of the vacated houses, auctioned others, and handed a number of them to the fire department, which burned them to the ground for training practice. Families who had been promised first choice of the new apartments could stand at the bottom of the hill and watch their old living rooms put out smoke. They were told the towers were coming. The towers never came, and the reason had nothing to do with money, engineering, or the families themselves. On August 29, 1952, Frank Wilkinson sat down to testify in a routine court hearing about property values in the ravine. A lawyer for opposing landowners stood up and asked him a question that had nothing to do with real estate. He asked Wilkinson to list every organization, political or otherwise, that he had belonged to since 1931. Wilkinson refused to answer. What he did not know was that the lawyer was working from a dossier on his private political life, compiled by the FBI and passed quietly to the housing program's enemies through the office of Los Angeles Police Chief William H. Parker. Within hours, Wilkinson was suspended. Within weeks, he and several colleagues who also refused to answer were fired. The city's most ambitious housing project had just lost its engine, and the timing was not an accident. It was the McCarthy era, and in Los Angeles, the real estate industry had discovered that the fastest way to kill public housing was to call it communism. The campaign worked on the public too. In June of 1952, the city put the housing program to a referendum, and 59% of voters said no. The courts ruled that the city's contract with the federal government was binding, and the vote changed nothing, which sounds like the program survived. It survived on paper. In 1953, a congressman named Norris Polson ran for mayor on a promise to kill public housing in Los Angeles, calling it un-American, and he beat the incumbent, Fletcher Bowron, who had backed a program. The new mayor renegotiated the whole arrangement down to a remnant, and Elysian Park Heights was cut from the plans entirely. The families were gone. The hill was scraped and silent, and the promise that had emptied it was formally dead. That left the city holding land it had taken from homeowners for a project it no longer intended to build, and in 1954 and 55, it solved that problem with a purchase. The city bought the ravine back from the federal government for about $1.3 million, a fraction of what had been spent assembling it, and the deed carried one condition: the land had to be used for a public purpose. Keep those 3 words in view, because the next 6 years of this story are a fight over what they mean. 300 acres of empty graded hillside, a mile from City Hall, legally reserved for the public. The city had no idea what to put on it. 3,000 miles away, in Brooklyn, a man was fighting his own city over a stadium. Walter O'Malley owned the Brooklyn Dodgers, and he wanted out of Ebbets Field. New York's power brokers would not give him the land to build a new one. In late 1955, a Los Angeles councilwoman named Rosalind Wyman, elected at 22, started writing to him, backed by County Supervisor Kenneth Hahn. In February of 1957, Mayor Polson himself led a delegation to meet O'Malley at the Dodgers spring training camp. The city that had just killed thousands of homes for the poor had found a public purpose it could love. The deal, approved by the city council on October 7, 1957, by a vote of 10-4, worked like this. The city would convey roughly 300 acres of Chavez Ravine to the Dodgers. The Dodgers would build a 50,000-seat stadium at their own expense, hand the city their minor league park, Wrigley Field in South Los Angeles, put up to $500,000 into a 40-acre public recreation area on the site, and $60,000 a year for 20 years to maintain it, give up half the mineral rights, and pay full property taxes, estimated at $345,000 a year. The city and county would spend about $2 million public dollars, mostly on roads. Supporters called it the best deal any city ever made to land a big league team, and they were not entirely wrong. Critics noticed that land assembled by evicting homeowners for public housing was about to become the private property of a baseball corporation, and they were not wrong either. The families whose checks had been cashed in the early 50s were watching from Lincoln Heights and El Sereno, waiting to see what public purpose was going to mean for them. One thing should be said plainly, because this story is told carelessly more often than it is told at all. The Dodgers did not clear those neighborhoods. The city and its housing authority did, years before Walter O'Malley ever saw the ravine, in the name of a housing project that died of politics. By the time the team arrived, the houses were nearly all gone. What the Dodgers deal did was answer permanently the question of who all that taking had been for. The families had been removed so that poor people could live on the hill. Now the hill was going to a ball club, and the last holdouts still living up there, the families who had refused every check, were about to find out what first choice was worth. The Dodgers played the 1958 season in the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum while the lawyers went to work. 78,672 people came to the first home game on April 18, 1958, the largest crowd ever to see a regular season game in the sport's history to that point. The Coliseum was a football bowl so vast that fans could barely follow the ball, so they brought transistor radios and pressed them to their ears, and a young broadcaster named Vin Scully talked an entire city through its new team. 3 miles away, the hill was almost silent. About 20 families had still been living in the ravine in 1957, scattered among the weeds and the empty foundations, in houses the city's paperwork said the city now owned. By the spring of 1958, they were down to roughly a dozen, holding on, waiting to see if the courts would let the deal stand. The deal had survived City Hall. It had not yet survived the city. Opponents of the contract forced it onto the ballot as Proposition B in June of 1958, and the campaign became one of the strangest civic spectacles in the city's history. 2 nights before the vote, local television station KTTV, Channel 11, aired a 5-hour telethon in defense of the deal, a format usually reserved for disease and disaster, except this one starred Jack Benny, George Burns, Debbie Reynolds, a young actor named Ronald Reagan, and the comedian Joe E. Brown, chairman of a group called the Taxpayers Committee for Yes on Baseball. It worked, barely. On June 3, 1958, in the largest turnout ever recorded for a city election to that point, the deal survived by 25,785 votes out of more than 677,000 cast. 52% to 48, a swing of 13,000 votes in a city of millions, and Dodger Stadium never exists. The families who had refused every check had just watched their own city vote by that sliver to finish their eviction. The Dodgers were coming to Los Angeles. The question looked settled. Then, 6 weeks later, a judge took the deal apart anyway. On July 14th, Superior Court Judge Arnold Prager ruled the contract void. His reasoning went to the center of everything this story is about. The land had been taken from its owners under the government's power of eminent domain for public housing. The deed said public purpose. A stadium owned by a private corporation, the judge held, was not a public purpose, and the city could not launder taken land into private hands by calling baseball a civic good. For the families watching from exile at the bottom of the hill, this was the first ruling in 8 years that read the promise the way they had. For 6 months, the stadium was legally dead. On January 13, 1959, the California Supreme Court reversed him unanimously, 7-0. Chief Justice Phil S. Gibson wrote that the contract had to be judged as a whole and taken as a whole, with its recreation area and its tax payments and its civic benefits. It served a public purpose. In October, the United States Supreme Court declined to hear the appeal without comment. That was the end. The promise in the 1950 letter had traveled 9 years through the American legal system and come out the other side meaning a ballpark. The public purpose that had taken the houses was now, officially, whatever the city said it was. All that now stood between the bulldozers and the stadium was a handful of families who had never signed anything. They had been asked to leave for public housing. They were about to be dragged out for a public purpose. What happened to them that spring was not the opening scene of a ballpark story. It was the last enforcement of a broken promise. The Arechiga family had lived at 1771 Malvina Avenue in Palo Verde since the 1920s. Manuel and Abrana had raised their children there, built the house themselves, and refused every offer the city ever made, through the housing project, through the cancellation, through the stadium deal. On the morning of May 8, 1959, sheriff's deputies forced the door. Movers carried the furniture out and set it on the ground. Abrana Arechiga, 66 years old, watched the house she had kept for 3 decades come apart and shouted in Spanish that the city should go play ball in the mayor's backyard, not in theirs. Her daughter, Aurora Vargas, a widow whose husband had died in the war, told the deputies they would have to carry her, and they did, 4 of them, down the steps and into a waiting car. She was arrested, fined, and briefly jailed. The bulldozers were already on the street. The house was rubble before the family's furniture had been moved off the property. That was a Friday. The newspapers called it Black Friday before the weekend was out. The family did not leave. They pitched tents beside the wreckage of their own home and camped there, on land they no longer owned, while photographers came and went, and the city argued about what it was seeing. For a few days, the Arechigas were the most sympathetic family in California, and the eviction played on television as exactly what it looked like. Then the story turned. Newspapers reported that the family owned several other rental houses around the city, and public sympathy collapsed almost overnight. The family answered that those houses belonged to grown children and other relatives, not to the elderly couple in the tent, and later researchers have largely borne that out. It did not matter. The turn gave the city cover, the cameras moved on, and the family eventually accepted about $10,000 for a property they had never wanted to price. 4 months later, on September 17, 1959, ground was broken for Dodger Stadium. That October, the Dodgers won the World Series, in their second season in Los Angeles, and one Coliseum game drew 92,706 people, the largest crowd ever to watch a World Series game to that point. The city had fallen completely, giddily in love with its team. The ravine, 3 miles from the celebration, was a construction site. What went up over the next 2.5 years was, by any engineering standard, magnificent. The tragedy of this story does not require the stadium to be ugly. Crews moved roughly 8 million cubic yards of earth, shearing off ridgelines, filling in the hollows where the streets had run, carving the hills into terraces, and setting the stands into the ground so that fans enter at the top and walk down toward the field. It cost about $23 million of Walter O'Malley's own money, the first privately financed major league park since Yankee Stadium in the 1920s. On April 10, 1962, 52,564 people watched the first game there, a 6-3 loss to Cincinnati. 2 months before that opening day, Frank Wilkinson walked out of federal prison. The blacklist had followed him for a decade after the ravine. In 1958, the House Un-American Activities Committee subpoenaed him again, and again he refused to answer, resting this time not on the Fifth Amendment, but on the First, on the argument that Congress had no business asking at all. He was convicted of contempt. The Supreme Court upheld it by a single vote, 5-4, and in May of 1961, he began 9 months in a federal cell. The man who had promised Chavez Ravine its new homes got out just in time to see the hill open for baseball. For the city, the 60s and 70s on that hill were golden. And this is the part many people watching this will remember in their own bodies. The smell of Dodger dogs, 30 cents in the early years, grilled by the tens of thousands, made by Farmer John from 1972 on. The transistor radio habit that had started in the Coliseum never died. So on summer nights, the stadium hummed with its own broadcast. Thousands of small radios tuned to KFI 640, a 50,000-watt signal that carried Vin Scully's voice across the deserts to Denver, describing the game to the people who were sitting in front of him. Scully would call Dodgers games for 67 seasons, and in 1981 came the strangest, sweetest chapter the Hill ever produced. A 20-year-old left-handed pitcher from a small town in Sonora, Mexico, named Fernando Valenzuela, took the opening day mound on April 9th, threw a shutout, won his first 8 starts, and set off Fernando Mania. Mexican-American Los Angeles, including families who had sworn for 20 years that they would never set foot in that stadium, filled the seats to watch him. He won Rookie of the Year and the Cy Young Award in the same season, and for one summer, the stadium on the Taken Hill belonged, at least on the nights Fernando pitched, to the people it had been taken from. The neighborhood itself survived in scattered pieces. The displaced families had spread across Los Angeles, into Lincoln Heights and El Sereno and City Terrace, and for decades the old residents gathered for reunion picnics under the name Los Desterrados, the Uprooted. In 1999, Don Normark, the photographer who had climbed the hill in 1949, published his pictures at last, and elderly people saw their childhoods, their parents, and their unlocked doors in print for the first time. A documentary followed. In 2005, the musician Ry Cooder released an album called Chavez Ravine, a song cycle about the neighborhood, the radios, the Red Scare, and the bulldozers, and it was nominated for a Grammy, which meant that for one winter the story of Palo Verde, Loma and Bishop sat on record store shelves across a country that had never heard of them. In the San Fernando Valley, the muralist Judy Baca had already painted the displacement into the Great Wall of Los Angeles, a half-mile of the city's buried history running along a flood channel, where the Ravines families appear beside the freeways that scattered other neighborhoods like theirs. Frank Wilkinson spent the rest of his long life as a civil liberties campaigner, and he eventually forced the FBI to hand over the file it had built on him. It ran to 132,000 pages. He never made peace with what his project had done to the ravine. "It is absolutely the tragedy of my life," he said. "I was responsible for uprooting hundreds of people from their own little valley and having the whole thing destroyed." He died in 2006, at 91. Melissa Arechiga is a great-granddaughter of Manuel and Abrana, the couple whose door the deputies forced in 1959. And she has spent years asking the city to say out loud what happened on that hill. In 2017, she and other descendants founded a group called Buried Under the Blue, asking for an apology, a monument, and compensation. The demand reached Sacramento. In 2024, an assembly member named Wendy Carrillo carried a bill called the Chavez Ravine Accountability Act, which would have created a task force to offer displaced families and their descendants city land or fair market compensation. It passed the legislature. In September of 2024, the governor vetoed it, saying the matter belonged to the city, not the state. Some descendants had opposed the bill anyway because it never mentioned the Dodgers by name. As of last year, there was still no apology, no monument on the property, and no compensation beyond the checks written in the 1950s. The stadium's own history pages celebrate the engineering. The 3 neighborhoods appear, when they appear at all, as a complicated chapter. Whether any of that adds up to erasure depends on what you find when you go looking for the place today. The erasure did not take. That is the honest verdict on the title of this film, and the families earned it themselves because a place is only erased when the last person stops saying its name, and the names never stopped. But everything else the city set out to do in 1950, it did, just not for the people it promised. This July, the Dodgers announced a crowd of 54,081, their 11th sellout of the season, the biggest baseball crowd in America this year. The stadium's address is 1000 Vin Scully Avenue. Only 2 big league ballparks in the country are older. The freeway signs, the fireworks nights, the palm trees behind the outfield pavilions, all of it sits on the graded remains of Palo Verde, Loma and Bishop. I went looking for Malvina Avenue on a current map of the city. It is not there. The street grid it belonged to was carved away with the hills, 8 million cubic yards at a time, and I found no marker on the property that carries the street names or the family names. The stadium is still there, and it is still beautiful. The deed language is still in the record, public purpose, 3 words that took a neighborhood and delivered a ball club. The letter of July 24, 1950 is still in the archives, with its promise of first choice. Somewhere under the third base side parking lots is the ground where Abrana Arechiga's kitchen stood, and where 4 deputies carried her daughter down the steps into the cameras. The people in the seats are not to blame for any of it. Most of them have simply never been told. 56,000 seats, filled all summer long, on a hill the city cleared for homes that were never built. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button in the middle to watch more forgotten places and abandoned history from across America. Then click the video on the left to watch similar stories like this. Or if you really want to get stuck in, click the playlist on the right. New videos every week. I'll see you in the next one.